We are live.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our second of the Fall Lunch and Learn series brought to you by the External Committee from the Graduate College. My name is Julia Imanoff, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. And we're super excited to have two of our scholars have the opportunity to share their presentations with you today. The way that this session is going to flow is that we're going to start off with some opening remarks, and then I'll introduce you to our two amazing speakers. They'll have about 20 minutes each to share their presentations with us, and at the end, we'll be able to have a question and answer period. There is a question and answer feature in the Zoom webinar, so please feel free throughout the presentations, type your questions in there. You don't have to wait till the very end. And finally, we're going to conclude our sessions with a short summary. So I wanted to first take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and this includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And even though we're connecting virtually and not in the University of Calgary space today, I would like to note that the university is situated on land that is adjacent to where the Bow River and the Elbow River meet. And that traditional Blackfoot name for that land is Mohkinstsis. And now we call that the city of Calgary. So for those of you who are new to our Lunch and Learn series, you may be wondering what it's all about. Well, basically, it's a public presentation series that aims to bridge the gap between the graduate college and the greater Calgary community. Our series has been going on since April, and we're continuing the series well into the fall and the winter. During each Lunch and Learn presentation, graduate scholars present their diverse research to the public. And without further ado, I'd like to tell you about today's presenters. We have Heidi JT Exner, who is an MBA JD candidate. Her research, conducted under the faculties of law and the Haskayne School of Business, focuses on white-collar crime and corporate governance and ethics issues. Her presentation today will be on normalizing deviance. The medium is the massage. And thereafter, we'll have Kelsey Pennanen, who is a PhD student in the Faculty of Archaeology, and she'll share with us a presentation on receding ice, revealing histories. Kelsey's research focuses on connecting to landscape and history through visual media. Okay, Heidi, the floor is all yours whenever you're ready. Take it away.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen really quickly here. Hi, everyone. So my name is Heidi, and I'm a first-year scholar at the Graduate College. The work I'm presenting today is called Normalising Deviance. The medium is the massage. This work was completed in the summer months of this year, and it was supervised by Dr. Lindsey Campbell, who is the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies at the Faculty of Law. White-collar crime is it's a broad term that encompasses a number of different activities, including but not limited to cybercrime, copyright infringement, bribery, things like tax evasion, forgery, and the misuse or misrepresentation of information that often involves or amounts to fraud. This work focuses specifically on investment fraud and the manner in which the perpetrators are treated by the Canadian justice system. There is no reliable data that speaks to the financial impact to individual and institutional investors who fall prey to fraudulent investment schemes. And this is partly because this activity is so largely underreported, and partly because the data that does exist comes from various sources, and it's not available to the public in a way that's easy to examine. Criminal prosecutions are relatively few and far between, and the criminal law is federal. Securities regulators are empowered as provincial and territorial bodies, and each one of these chooses what information to present or withhold from the public and how to present it, et cetera. So the two self-regulating organizations, which is the IROC, Investment Industry Regulatory Organization, and the MFDA, which is the Mutual Funds Dealers Association, also choose which information to make public. So those are really the governing bodies around the cases that I'm examining. The overwhelming majority of investment fraud, though, is addressed by securities regulators instead of the criminal justice system. So as we can see, I'm just going to start with a breakdown of the capital markets in Canada. So Canada's capital markets activity comes primarily out of Ontario, largely because it's a home to the Toronto Stock Exchange. But we can see that the markets activity mainly comes out of just 4 provinces, which are Ontario, Alberta, Quebec, and BC. The remaining provinces and territories only make up for about 4%. So examining data from securities regulators from each of the provinces and territories is really not an easy task. This basic graph reflects days and days on end of manually gathering and pulling information that these regulators make available in different formats and different ways. So notice that Alberta only reflects administrative fines, and Quebec simply just doesn't have data available. I actually approached each securities regulator in each province and territory for their data, including the Alberta Securities Commission and the AMF, the Autorité des Marchés Financiers, without much success. So in terms of fines that are outstanding in these capital markets, it's tough to get a really good feel, like a comparison for the top 4. But what we can see from this is that billions of dollars of penalties outstanding do sit on the table. And what we can also see is perhaps one of the reasons securities regulators don't make their data as readily available as they could. The delinquency rates for gathering penalties are pretty enormous. These 2 provinces, Alberta and British Columbia, are pretty much representative of what I could gather from across Canada. So we can see we're looking at an 86 to 87% delinquency rate, which is quite high. And this indicates that there might be a nationwide problem here. So essentially, securities regulators are imposing fines to individuals and corporations that are found to be violating the Securities Act, but they're just not collecting them. So what about the criminal justice system and securities and self-regulating organizations? So I stated earlier that most investment fraud is not dealt with by the criminal justice system. In Canada, the Supreme Court has not really provided an exhaustive definition of what constitutes fraud through jurisprudence. The Criminal Code does define fraud affecting the public market, which is an indictable offense. But I argue that when this activity is addressed by regulating bodies instead of the criminal justice system, it is de facto legalized. So in layman's terms, I argue that when something is regulated instead of criminally prosecuted, that itself legalizes it. Legalizing investment fraud is the first step to normalizing it. Cooperation among securities regulators and the criminal justice system has improved in the last 5 to 10 years or so, although there's still very little cooperation or sharing of information on an overall level. Mark Cluhan, who is one of the handful of Canadian scholars in this particular area, suggests that self-regulating organizations have better access to information and might be better able to inform regulators in the criminal justice system, although they instead appear to prefer to deflect instances from the justice system. And there are many reasons that this could be so, partly because they are a private body and their members are the market participants. So they're the brokers and the people who typically commit these frauds. So it's protecting their own interests to some extent. So starting with all of that information, the first step to looking at how the perpetrators are treated is to gather an understanding of elite deviance. So what I did was I did a survey to understand that elite deviance to date approaches the matter in a way that is anchoring, and it's anchored in finding ways to explain how and under what conditions it occurs. So how and under what conditions, say, white collar crime occurs. So it's a relatively new area of study, and the academic concept of white collar crime was only really explored from 1939 onward, when Edward Sutherland coined the term. Subsequent work has either been based on or in response to his ideas about how and why it occurs. So my work doesn't seek to explain how or why white collar crime happens, but rather it looks at how it occurs in terms of who the perpetrators are and how they go about executing their fraudulent schemes in order to ascertain indicators that influence the way individuals behind these schemes are treated by legal authorities in order to pinpoint key variables that might influence this process. An extensive historical examination of the way white-collar crime, specifically relating to commerce, has been treated under the common law going back to Britain in the 18th century, suggests that the law has been used sort of as a tool to suppress social climbers, if you will, in favor of the interests of gentry and members of the aristocracy. Much of commerce was controlled by these parties when these laws were sort of conceptualized, I guess, or conceptualized. The law, this is a law that's carried over to Canada. We still work under the common law system. An examination of the legal system around the first stock exchange, though, which is the Amsterdam Exchange, and it started in the early 17th century, shows that market malfeasance was dealt with in manners that more effectively provided justice for victims of investment fraud. So one thing to note that is that this was in the early days of the Dutch VOC, and social mobility was embraced a lot more in this particular environment in society. So how can we take this information and apply it? Well, this is where the theory comes in. Diane Vonn has laid some wonderful groundwork to account for the way deviant behavior is normalized in particular environments. And starting with her examination of what happened internally that led to the Space Challenger explosion in 1986. Her theory focuses largely on a particular group of people who normalize their own behavior, though. And therefore, in order to apply it effectively to determine how a party such as securities regulators or the criminal justice system might normalize deviance of individuals who are outside of their own group, the way that key aspects of the behavior, the perceived risk and consequences, etc., they have to be accounted for to these outside parties. So this is where it gets fun. Marshall McLuhan was a Canadian communications theorist who is largely known for the expression, "the medium is the message." This has been warped and twisted, and by him and many other scholars to the medium is the mass age, and ultimately the medium is the massage. So this is a reference to the fact that the medium of something that's being examined or the source of information can actually control the narrative itself. So McLuhan suggests that it not only can, but it does influence the ways a message is received and processed by others. And Vonn's work also examines messaging or communication in the sense that it factors in specific environmental elements into group dynamics. Using the perpetrators as the mediums, this can account for messaging that is either internal to an environment or external to it. It takes out the internal-external factor. McLuhan's approach enables me to apply Vonn's normalization of deviance theory to outside parties from the eyes of securities regulators and criminal justice to the medium that is the perpetrators of investment fraud. So 3 case studies that I worked with are, I'll go through them one by one. So the first one is an exempt market securities scheme that was perpetrated by a man named David Michael Michaels. I love saying that guy's name. So this one took place in Victoria, BC in the mid to late 2000s, 2007 to 10-ish. And this man actually targeted his victims specifically based on their age and their net worth. There's a rather large, wealthy retirement community based in Victoria, BC. And what he did was he actually purchased airtime on a local radio station, CFAX 1070, and represented himself, or rather misrepresented himself, as an investment expert who wanted to help senior citizens save money and prepare for their own children, grandchildren, and legacy, basically. This is a pretty bold move, and it was a pretty extreme measure in terms of, like, basically hiding in plain sight. The lie was quite plain, and it was broadcast on the radio every week. He gathered an audience of about 20,000 listeners. So a lot of the elements that come into play with this case study that were examined were industry knowledge and the complexity of his scheme. While his scheme wasn't necessarily all that complex, exempt market securities, in a nutshell, they're a specific type of security that doesn't require certain documentation, but it does require the investor to have a certain level of net worth. So, like, that in itself is also indicative of the targeting for his particular victims. And when he was caught and prosecuted in 2014, or eventually prosecuted in 2014, he was millions of dollars of fines were levied on him. And he was actually able to avert paying a single dime of those all the way up until 2019. And a large way he ended up doing that was through transferring of a condo that he bought in Hawaii. So he understood that jurisdictional elements could come into play. And at the time, it was a quote unquote legal transfer. It was for $10 to his wife at the time. And it took until 2019 for the British Columbia Securities Commission to work with the Ontario Securities Commission and the US courts to place an order for the sale of this property. The second case is a well-known case, especially in Calgary. So if you guys are familiar with the Bre-X scandal, Michael de Guzman and John Felderhoff, they were two of the three parties behind this. And this happened in the late 1990s. So this was a mining fraud that took place primarily in Indonesia. So they purchased a large tract of land, and they hoped to find gold in this land. And I think the original intent was that they really did hope to find it, but it turned out that there wasn't really a lot there. And they were manipulating test results and going through pretty extreme measures. Michael de Guzman allegedly even shaved gold off of his own wedding band to falsify records for this. And this in turn manipulated the stock, and it shot up through the roof, obviously based on false information. And then when it was found out that these records had been manipulated, a lot of people lost an awful lot of money. So victim profile plays some role. A lot of institutional investors, pension funds, things like that were pretty heavily invested at the time. Jurisdiction plays a pretty big role in this as well. So does industry knowledge and complexity of scheme, and bold moves and extreme measures. So the third one is Elizabeth Holmes. And I included this case because it's very tough to find a case study where the perpetrator is a female. And I thought it was worth examining how gender might factor in to the way a perpetrator is treated under the eyes of the law. So there's really not, it's tough to find a case where there's enough comparable details for examination. Much of the way she executed her scheme actually relied on gender stereotypes. So for example, deepening her voice, mimicking male idols, if you will, or well-known male figures. And a lot of things actually ended up being quite practiced and a very conscious effort. Whether she was aware that they were relying on gender stereotypes specifically as a conscious thing or not, I mean, nobody can really quite determine that. But the gender implications are very evident. So because this is an American case, though, and the differences between Canadian and US Securities and Exchange Commissions and securities regulators, and of course the criminal justice system differences needed to be acknowledged. But through acknowledging this, it becomes evident that the US treats this type of crime in general, quite differently than Canada. For example, the US identifies and prosecutes 20 times more market fraud than Canada. So insider trading, that sort of thing, when population and everything else is actually factored in. And their system and evident tolerance of this activity is a pretty sharp contrast, considering we are neighbors and we consider ourselves pretty alike in a lot of ways, versus Canada's, which the way our system is set up almost enables fraudsters in quite a shocking way. So the US parallels a little more with the Amsterdam Exchange, and it also has a higher rate of initial public offerings than Canada. So it's speculative at this point in my research to say that the degree to which societies foster enterprise is something that might factor in, but it is something that has caught my eye. So with this case, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US has already thrown the book at her, and her criminal trial dates for multiple charges are actually coming up pretty quickly here in November. So looking at, victim profiles and power alliances actually factor into this as well. The victims of her scheme tended to be wealthier individuals. So a lot of the Silicon Valley tech type people and some institutional investors as well. And the medical community as a whole also played a role as a victim. Power alliances, because this kind of ties into the gender element, where she perpetrated this scheme with the help of her then longtime romantic partner, who was a powerful and pretty connected male. And a lot of his connections and his power were used to fortify the position of the company Theranos. But then once that was no longer there and she was standing alone in front of the court, you can see it's a very different dynamic that comes into play. So I touched on a few when I was explaining this, but the key variables identified through this work are industry knowledge and complexity of scheme, jurisdiction, bold moves and extreme measures, victim profiles, power alliances, gender, and the degree to which society fosters enterprise. So since August, I've actually pulled it all apart. One of the major issues with this work is that through my background research and case studies, I uncovered way too many goodies to address in one paper. So what I'm doing right now is I'm taking some of the areas of interest that really piqued a lot more curiosity that need further examination, and I'm incorporating them more with the legal procedural elements of each particular case. And as the Theranos decision comes out, or the Elizabeth Holmes, I should say, decision comes out, and hopefully more information will be made public about what actually transpires in those trials. Hopefully that will be informative as well from the gender perspective. To my knowledge, nobody has studied investment fraud from a gender perspective, and very few study white collar crime at all from a gender perspective as well. Ding, light bulb. So this work is actually part one of a series that I have planned. So subsequent work on corporate white collar crime from governance and ethics perspective is planned under the Histine School of Business. It was tentatively planned for next summer, but depending on what happens with the pandemic, we'll see exactly when the timing of that comes in. So yeah, for more information on why it's important to study white collar crime, it's completely understudied around the globe. And I'm actually hoping to encourage more contributions to this knowledge base by providing a platform and competitive scholarship to those who wish to contribute. So I started the Exner Foundation, and that's what this is for. It provides a platform for people who do research in this area, and it is a very small handful at this point, but hoping to promote this among the student body and generate a little bit of interest and maybe some incentive as well through scholarship. So I'm actually currently working on partnering with other organizations in Canada and for the knowledge base end. And I'm in the process of setting this foundation up from the nuts and bolts end as well. So board committee, all of that lovely stuff, scholarship parameters. Yeah, but for more information, please feel free to contact me if anybody is interested in this area. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for watching. And if you guys have any questions, please let me know.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Heidi, for that really thought-provoking presentation. So for our attendees, yes, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and we'll go through the questions during the Q&A period at the end. And for now, we're going to jump to Kelsey's presentation. So go ahead, Kelsey, whenever you're ready.
Hi, let me just share my screen here. Excellent. Hopefully everyone can see that. Thank you so much, Heidi, for that wonderful presentation. Very enlightening. I learned a lot about white-collar crime. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my PhD project. I've titled this presentation Receding Ice, Revealing Histories. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm currently located on Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot peoples. But today we're going to be talking about what's colloquially known as the Yukon Territory and the traditional territory of the Don peoples. So to give you a little bit of a roadmap for our discussion today, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the study area. We'll get into the background of the project and how my project fits into this larger role. The archaeology of the area, we're going to talk about the methods I'm going to employ to do this research, community engagement thus far, and some of my next steps, as I'm a second-year PhD student in the department, so my project's still sort of getting underway. I was fortunate enough this summer to spend about 6 weeks in the Southern Yukon, conducting preliminary work. This was after a 2-week isolation in a dry cabin, which was a joy. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, but I want to situate before we get started into our study area. So I'm going to be talking about a location in Northwest Canada, which is colloquially known as the Yukon Territory. This landscape's very important as it's slightly managed differently than what we know with the numbered treaties, maybe as Southern settlers. So the Yukon Territory is actually an example of a modern day treaty where the First Nations have a lot of the power and control over how the land is managed, based on negotiations between those nations and the Canadian government, negotiated through modern treaties. So my research takes place in this area I've highlighted here, colloquially known as the Southern Lakes area of the Yukon Territory. And as you can see in this image, it overlaps traditional territories of numerous First Nations groups within the area. So some of my collaborative community partnerships include Carcross-Tagish First Nation, located in Carcross, as well as Kwanlin Dun First Nation, located in Whitehorse, and Champagne and Asiatic First Nations out of Haines Junction. So this area is unbelievably beautiful. It's so important, and it shows the evidence of these peoples living on this landscape for thousands of years. So the area that I'm working in, this Southern Lakes area, I'll give you a bit of a background into the area and what it looks like, basically. So as you can see in this image here, this landscape, similarly to the Rocky Mountains in Calgary, near Calgary, sort of a continuation of those Rocky Mountains into the northern area. So it has a lot of large inland lakes, freshly stocked, containing tons of fish. It has beautiful valleys, it has high mountainous regions. And of course, this landscape shows the evidence of the Dun people living here for thousands of years and really thriving throughout this landscape. So it's a super important place, and I'm so excited to share it with you today. Before I sort of get going more into this research, I want to place it back maybe to something that might be a little more familiar to some of us here in Calgary, and how these landscapes, both here at home in Calgary and in the north, are being impacted by change, and how these are landscapes of change. So this visualization I'm showing you on the screen is actually the Athabasca Glacier. Some of you who live in Calgary may have visited this before. It's about an hour and a half, I think, drive northwest of Calgary if you go up the Icefields Parkway. And it's a really impressive site. But as you can see in these two images provided by the Mountain Legacy Project, this image at the top here showing what the glacier looked like in 1917, then the bottom image showing exactly that same location in 2011. Having this stark contrast next to each other certainly shows us the impact climate change is having in these mountainous regions with the ice melting and disappearing. Showing these visualizations is immensely powerful as it really enacts within us that climate change is real, that it's happening, and it's impacting these landscapes around us all the time. This is particularly prevalent in the north. So just as the Athabasca Glacier is melting, glaciers and ice patches in the Yukon Territory are unfortunately suffering the same fate. So my research is going to be particularly looking at ice patches, not glaciers, and I'll explain why that is. So just to give you a little more background for those of you that may not be glaciologists, glaciers are actually formed due to snow accumulation, but they actually travel down slope into those valley bottoms. And glaciers are extremely mobile. So they're always moving into lower territory as snow becomes accumulated on, it gets pushed into ice and they're moving down slope. Ice patches, conversely, usually are formed in high mountainous areas, so near the top of mountains, and they're really immobile. So basically the snow accumulates and over time compresses into ice, but they don't travel. They're very stagnant and usually pretty discrete in their size. Historically, and during pre-contact period, how people would actually use glaciers is that they would use them as travel corridors. So as glaciers were really large and they provided a relatively safer and flatter landscape for traversing over mountainous areas, glaciers were actually used as travel routes for people to get from some of those coastal areas to inland areas. And traditionally, there was a lot of interaction and trade happening between the peoples that lived on the coast and the peoples that were more inland. Ice patches are more stagnant and they're usually used for hunting, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. But basically, from an archaeological perspective, artifacts that are contained with glaciers usually get kind of ripped up and really destroyed because of the fact that glaciers are so mobile. So there was actually a recovery made of a human body, Quanade Dan Tasinchi it was named, which means person long ago found, in 1999 from a glacier near the border of the Yukon and British Columbia, near the Yukon-British Columbia border. And this individual is actually determined to be about 300 to 500 years old. And they were actually using that glacier as a travel corridor to get from the coast to an inland place. DNA analysis of this individual found that they are directly related through their maternal line to 17 individuals still living in that traditional territory and First Nation, belonging to those First Nations today. So it's a really remarkable find. And ice patches, unfortunately, that find was, he was pretty ripped apart, and a lot of the artifacts found in association with him were very far separated due to the nature of glaciers. Ice patches, though, provide a perfect opportunity for preservation of artifacts. Because they're not immobile, it allows artifacts that are even better preserved to be recovered. So I will be looking more at ice patches in my research. One thing they both have in common, of course, is that they're both melting and currently experiencing significant change due to warming climate. So this is a picture I took this summer, just to give you an idea. Here is my collaborator from the Yukon government, that's Christian Thomas, standing there. He's been working, he grew up in Whitehorse, so he's been working on these landscapes his entire life. He's been involved in this Yukon archaeology ice patch project for over 15 years. And he's been actually visiting this ice patch continually during that time, looking for artifact recoveries. And in his memory, he recalls the Granger ice patch pictured here actually being so much larger in extent. And you can actually see in this lichen-free or vegetation-free zone that I've roughly outlined here, the extent of where the ice patch used to be. And we can see this based on the evidence that there's no vegetation growing there as the ice used to be in that area. This location shown in blue is, of course, where the ice patch is today, showing that significant decrease. This means there's a lot of change happening in this area, but it's not all need for despair, as there is an opportunity for artifacts to actually be recovered thus out of this melt zone. So this is where the archaeology comes into play. So within this melt zone, basically since the first artifact recovery was made by hunters in 1994, artifacts, over 400, have actually been found melting out of ice patches throughout the Yukon Territory. So this includes a lot of spear points, arrowheads, and also paleontological specimens. So that basically means a lot of bones. All that is found recovered out of these ice patches. So that makes this a really awesome area for preservation. Here's some photos I took for this summer. Modified bone recovered the ice patch, as well as some sheep's horns that are sort of decomposing in place. A smaller little bone that was found, sort of showing that history of use through time of this area. What's really phenomenal about the ice patches is the opportunity for preservation, and it provides a window into the past that we do not get in any other context. So due to the nature of ice and that it cryogenically freezes the organics that are preserved within it, it means we're able to recover artifacts that we do not see in any other context. So, it's really amazing. I get so excited talking about this. This spear right here, I think, is the probably the best significance of the ice patch recovery. So it's over a 2-meter long dart. So it was actually used, people hunting traditionally would use spears, such as hunt woolly mammoths. And then they invented the atlatl, which is sort of like a throwing dart, which would allow you to hunt animals from a little bit further away. This was used for about 8,000 years in North America before the invention of the bow and arrow, which was, depends in Canada when it was used, but around 1,000 to 200 years ago, that came to play. So for most of human history in hunting, it was using something called the atlatl and dart. We have an example of one here. And what's so remarkable is in archaeology, all we typically end up finding are these spear points. So this is made out of rock. Of course, this isn't going to decompose and degrade over time because it's a rock. But what we hardly ever find in archaeology is what this is attached to. So the ice patches actually provide an opportunity for us to see the wood that was attached to the spears. We can see the sinew that is used to haft this point on. We can see the feathers that were used for fletching. We can see the ochre that was used for pigmentation to basically paint red and create markers and other identifying characteristics onto these spear points. So it's an amazing window into the past that we don't get anywhere else. And it's super important to document, as Indigenous history in this area and throughout Canada isn't as recognized and promoted as much as settler history is. So these artifacts help to tell the story of the amazing and long-standing and really resilient, powerful, thriving history of the First Nations people within this landscape. It's phenomenal. And the reason that these artifacts are actually recovered in these ice patches is due to a pretty interesting use of these ice patches, both in the pre-contact period and continuing on today. So the reason that artifacts are typically found in ice patches is that caribou actually seek ice patches in the summer months as a way of escaping the hot summer heat in July and August. So as surprising as it is, Yukon can actually get pretty hot. And caribou and sheep will actually seek out these ice patches in the high mountains as there's snow that will last a longer period of time, basically to escape the heat. Another factor is to escape the bugs. So anyone who has ever done field work in the Arctic knows the bugs are extremely bad. And oral history from this time even suggests that after hunting the caribou, sometimes you couldn't even use the hides for clothing or for shelters, as sometimes there were so many holes in the hides from the botflies and the bugs. So a lot of the caribou would seek refuge on these ice patches as a way of escaping the heat and the bugs. And hunters, people are really smart. They knew to take advantage of this. And this is still used today. So this is actually a photo I took this summer, sort of facing one direction. We had a little group of caribou come and visit us. They were curious of us. So this is standing right facing one direction, and then facing the other direction here, we have an ice patch, and this sort of feature constructed right in front of it. So this feature here is actually called a hunting blind or a game lookout. And this is what I will be studying for my PhD. So this is a more modern example. You can see this is the chair someone has constructed here, and they've sort of dug out a place maybe to keep their lunch while they're waiting. But basically how these hunting blind or game lookouts work, both in the modern day and in the past. Here's an example of a pre-contact, so a long ago used hunting blind, but these traditions are still continuing today. And basically how it would work is the hunter would be crouched behind this rock pile to help disguise themselves into the surrounding landscape to hide from the caribou. And they would be waiting, observing the ice patch, waiting for the caribou to then come seek refuge in the higher area. So as soon as they would sort of come over that mountain edge to seek refuge, that's when the hunter would come out and push and then catch. My boyfriend's a hunter and always gives me heck for saying catch instead of hunt. They hunted the caribou. And yeah, so this is how the hunting blinds are used, and this is what I am observing. So these landscapes and these areas are really threatened. And as Indigenous archaeology researcher George Nicholas wrote recently, the continued destruction of Indigenous sites, burial ground, and sacred places can be construed as a form of continued violence against Indigenous people. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples state that the protection of cultural heritage is a right for all people. So thereby failing to recognize the significance of these historic places can be construed as violence against these people, not recognizing the importance of these landscapes for longstanding survival and resilience of these communities into the present day. So my research will look at how we can protect, preserve, and present these landscapes in ways that help connect people back to this place. And archaeology has traditionally been used as a really colonial tool to push forward the objectives of settlers, but I want to explore how we can use archaeology to better move forward the goals of these self-governing First Nations and their agenda, and how they can help to use archaeology in settlement land claims and to prove through evidence of the long-standing history of their use of this landscape and their right to continue to use and be within this landscape. So my project will sort of fit within this pre-existing ice patch project, but looking at how we can digitize and best share these landscapes to really convince all Canadians of the monumental aspect of these areas. So that's what we'll be looking at today. For my methods, the first step that I had conducted this summer is to actually go to these ice patches and identify ice patches that contain caribou dung and these hunting blind complexes. So caribou dung will indicate that caribou and sheep were using that, and the hunting blind complexes, of course, indicate that hunters were using this landscape through time. This was conducted this summer using helicopter surveys. One of the areas in particular I will be looking at is this lake called Alligator Lake, which I was informed through that it might have been a mistranslation in the English language of what actually means Altogether Lake. So this was a really, based on that place name, a really significant area for a lot of people. And we can see in the archaeological record, all these yellow dots indicate archaeological sites in the vicinity. These ones down here near to Alligator Lake are all campsites, so where people would have been camping and living. And then these areas represent where those hunting blinds are actually found. So it's likely that families would stay by the lake, and then hunters would make a trip up to the mountaintop to hunt the caribou on these ice patches before returning home, perhaps in the evening or after a slightly extended trip. So this is some satellite footage of that area, showing our research area there, zooming into the mountaintop here. And we can see that's what that landscape sort of looks like from that mountaintop, with Alligator Lake seen in the background here, and then that ice, or that hunting blind and ice patch in the foreground here. So the methods I'm actually going to be using to document and digitize these landscapes include using UAVs, so drones basically, equipped with cameras to create numerous overlapping photographs of the mountainous landscape that I can then use to conduct photogrammetry and basically create 3D models of this landscape. So these 3D models will be combined with panoramic imagery, which basically is this fancy camera that takes 360-degree photos and videos. And that will be combined with like traditional archaeological landscape survey of the area to find any more features to then document and collect. So these landscapes are very significant, and I'm going to combine these models with ecological data, so caribou collaring data, government information relating to where artifacts have been found, the dates of artifact recoveries, and then combine all of these lines of information together into an integrated 3D GIS system, so a way of mapping and managing this landscape into the future. And one of the methods will be to actually use photogrammetry of some of the hunting blinds to create 3D models. So here's some of the preliminary models I've been making showing the hunting blind. There's again where the hunter would have been sitting, showing the rock piles. This is showing one of those, sorry, this is all very preliminary. I only just got back, so I've just kind of been making these models in the last few weeks, but this is one of the hunting blind landscapes, the Alligator Lake. And I want to see how these ice patches all related to each other to get a better idea of communal hunting within the area. So how basically people would have been working together to hunt caribou to sustain themselves. So in this example, imagine if the ice patch was sort of over here, we have these 3 hunting blinds in a row that would have all been used by people simultaneously to best get a bigger harvest and survive those long cold winters in the Yukon. So ensuring you have a lot of meat to survive the winter. So this amazing heritage is rather inaccessible. And one of the goals of this project is to look at how we can create the technological capacity within these communities to host and display these models. So here's one of the models that I've created. Looking again at that alligator or altogether lake compound. Each of those annotations are the numbered hunting blinds. What's interesting of this model is you can actually see the game trails pretty clearly on this model. So where the caribou and sheep would have been traversing the landscape to move from the lower areas towards the ice. And you'll see how the hunting blinds are really strategically located along those game trails to best intercept them as they're on their journey. So no one's really done a full systematic study ever of these landscapes and how they all would have interacted together. So I'm hoping to use these innovative models of digital technology to form a better idea of understanding this landscape and hopefully to monumentalize it. So something like UNESCO World Heritage can begin to understand how this mountaintop is just as important as something like a pyramid in Egypt. So Indigenous Canadian history, it needs to be recognized, and a strong argument can be made that allowing this destruction of heritage, whether through intent or through neglect, really needs to be, we need to examine this, and we really need to work on promoting and preserving and sharing Indigenous cultural heritage, especially in Canada. So this can be used as a tool to help promote the history of reconciliation in this area. So part of my research questions, as archaeologists, we always try to be as scientific and therefore as objective as possible. But in that search, we're removing people from the landscape. So I want to look at more of how do we incorporate the experience of these hunters and the human beings back into the landscape to ensure that their history is recognized. So what I'm hopefully looking at is how to best understand the past and how to best promote and share it using these digital technologies, and how we can engage new narratives into archaeological sites as places of abundance that are important. So how do we create public-facing spheres that talk about these spaces in ways that best promote reconciliation in Canada? Because my cumulative experiences have demonstrated to me that all people deserve an opportunity to know their past. And as responsible citizens in Canada, in an era of reconciliation, we do have an accountability to engage collaboratively and to seek ways of moving forward. It's our shared ethical duty in this country to protect the heritage, to recognize the long-standing history of Indigenous people in this country, and to share and connect with this in innovative ways, in whichever ways we can. So I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing cultural leaders, one of them being Kyra Chambers, pictured here. We had the opportunity to work together this summer on the landscapes, and she will be running my camp, or our camp, for continuing the research next summer, looking at more of these landscapes. And she is such an amazing person. Some of her words, just talking about what a feeling it was for her to be able to walk in the same footsteps that her ancestors walk in, and how her returning to these landscapes shows that continued connection between people, caribou, and the land. So she's a really amazing youth leader. And having shared these landscapes with her, we have a responsibility to share this landscape with the rest of Canada, and to allow it to be documented and preserved, to be shared for future generations. So showing this leadership, how we can bring youth to the land, how we can share this with as many people as we can, is part of the next steps of my research. So through working collaboratively with knowledge keepers and elders in the communities, heritage managers and land planners, we're going to all work together in how we can best share and model these landscapes. I'm still getting started, of course, so my future directions are to complete the GIS viewshed analysis. I have to plan the drone flights and the 2021 field season, including all of our camps, actually execute and conduct it. And then the final step over the next few years will be curating all the websites and outreach platforms to share this as best we can. And of course, want to acknowledge all of my amazing community partners, funding agencies, my supervisor, Dr. Peter Dawson, and all the wonderful folks that I work with. And that is all. Thank you very much. And I look forward now to the question period.
Awesome. Thank you guys both so much for such amazing presentations. I'm just going to pull the slides back up here. And we did have quite a few questions, so I'm going to dive right into it if that's okay with you guys. Let me just get that one up. Here we go. So first question is for Heidi. There are specific criminal code offenses relating to investment fraud and stock manipulation. Why does the government prefer prosecution under the regulatory security scheme instead of the criminal code?
Okay, I see that question is from Lisa Silver, and she's actually a criminal law prof. So if I'm not mistaken, you're referencing section 380, specifically section 382 of the criminal code, which covers market fraud. So through my cases, I ask the exact same question. And the go-to answer is it has to do with the division of powers for the Canadian Constitution. So the criminal code is a federal head of power, and securities regulators are provincial powers. They have a little less gumption, I guess. They have a little less ability, but it's a pretty interesting examination when you look at the dynamics between the two. But a lot of it actually stems from lack of ability to collect evidence as well, and to understand the mechanisms of these schemes. So this is how specialized knowledge plays in, and but even in instances where there appears to be sufficient evidence to prosecute these events criminally, they're still essentially deferring it to regulators. So if you keep in mind that regulators play multiple roles and have competing interests, so a lot of those competing interests actually rely on keeping the status quo within the market. The interesting part is that there are surveillance advantages especially among non-government or legal regulators. So self-regulating organizations, for example, that can be used, but parties aren't operating together to actually use them effectively. And the same goes for criminal powers and for regulatory powers. They can and have acted in tandem, but they just don't. A lot of it has to do with the division of powers issue, because one is a federal and one is provincial or territorial. And a lot of it also just happens, it appears to be a resistance. There's more to it than the heads of power answer that a lot of people, especially under law, would provide. I think I've answered that. I might have talked in circles. I hope not.
Thanks so much, Heidi.
Yeah.
We have some other questions for Kelsey as well. Actually, a few about how can you age and date the creation of the hunting binds that will tell you when they were last used, or of the dating of the artifacts themselves. What techniques do you use?
Yeah, for sure. I can answer that. So the hunting blinds, it's really difficult to actually date just a stack of rocks. So we can't really date those specifically. And they do show a continuous, some evidence of the continuous use through time. So it's likely these were constructed a long time in the past and then continually used for potentially thousands of years. The evidence we have for dating it actually comes from the ice patch itself. So any organics contained within the ice patch, which basically is like any wood or faunal, like bones from animals that we find, we can date that using carbon-14 dating, which is basically a stable isotope of carbon. It has a 5,736 year half-life. And basically we can determine precisely the amount of time that half-life, the stable isotope takes to unstable isotope takes to become stable. Can't remember exactly how it is, but basically carbon-14 dating, and it gives us a pretty accurate, reliable indication for an age range. Since the nuclear bomb's been dropped, though, we can't do it past 1950. So it's anything older than 1950 because of chemistry. Yeah, so it's basically through carbon-14 dating of the artifacts themselves.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, we have another question for Heidi. Are there penalties for convicted Canadians, fraudsters, only monetary, or do they face prison terms?
Okay. So hi Adrian. So we should be careful about calling these convicted fraudsters, because the data that I presented was from securities regulators. So these aren't people who were convicted of a criminal offense. They were subject to regulatory penalties. So, I mean, just to establish that first and foremost. So in extreme instances, a regulatory body can impose a jail sentence. It's just not common though, largely due to the division of powers issue that I very likely skirted over regarding the provincial and territorial bodies. And also those who are subject to securities tribunals and trials and who are found liable for their acts, they don't have criminal records. So the answer is sometimes, but very, very rarely. Securities regulators call themselves quasi-criminal bodies. And that's true to some extent, but you can see that there's not really a lot of teeth to the sanctions that they impose.
Wonderful. And I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to put it back to Kelsey. You mentioned briefly UNESCO. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on the connection to UNESCO and the role that this project plays in helping gain World Heritage designation in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this project, at the request of community, they've been, particularly Carcross Tagish has been looking at how to actually monumentalize and create recognition of these important sites for World Heritage designation, because that will allow the community to better protect these areas in a way that they see fit. So part of that is that UNESCO needs a lot of scientific evidence to demonstrate the importance of a place. And one way of doing this is through something like digital modeling. So they need something, some sort of media output that UNESCO can then use to help basically in their nomination process and looking at the evaluation as what gets designation, what doesn't. They need a lot of this evidence to be put forth. So part of my role in this project is to help to create that evidence through these models, through this digital media that can actually be used within this larger nomination package to be put forth for UNESCO so that these areas can be recognized in the world scale for their historic importance in this place and what they mean to all Canadians, especially the people residing in this landscape, and how this demonstrates this history for thousands and thousands of years.
That's awesome. I'm so inspired by both of your presentations today. Thank you so much. Those are all the questions we have time for, but thank you to Heidi and Kelsey for sharing their research with us, and to our guests for taking time out of your busy day to join us and to participate in the Q&A. Your questions were really, really, really appreciated. It was a pleasure to have everyone here today for our second fall series, Lunch and Learn. Please feel free to connect with the Graduate College on our social media. Our tag is there, or on our website, and you can find more information about upcoming events. And we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.